Hello, it's Dawn Michelle and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to be doing another roundup of Decan decks. This time we're going to be looking at decks that feel like Libra. My brain had such a difficult time reconciling the idea of Libra energy with the current spooky season October feel, and I'll share with you why that is. So I've been using The Stars Within You, a modern guide to astrology, and I'm doing this whole decks that feel like Decans to me in alignment with the Decan Walk that is currently being hosted by Marlena Teresa. I will leave a link to her playlist below in case you want to check that out. So moving into the season from September 23rd to October 22nd. So I guess technically we're like coming up at the tail end of this Libra season. So maybe that's like I'm just already all in the spooky season vibes and reconciling this idea of being in the ruling planet of Venus, the planet of beauty and love, and the main descriptors being like romantic and talking about museums and songwriting and making art and all of that, which is beautiful energy, but my brain is like already in spooky season mode. So this one was a bit hard for me to reconcile because the decks I tend to gravitate toward through the end of September and into the beginning of October clearly are not in alignment with Libra energy. So as I already mentioned, the ruling planet for Libra is Venus. The symbol is the scales. It's cardinal air, and the keyword often associated with it is I balance. But it does list up here the romantic. So which, yeah, tracks with like connecting to Venus energy. I can totally see that. That's just not the energy that I'm currently in. But I did go ahead and pick out 8 decks. Yes, 8 decks for you. I have 4 mass market, 4 indie, and we're going to see how well they align with Libra energy or not. So the first deck that I grabbed when thinking about this idea of Libra energy and really tapping into the idea of romance, but also those balancing, harmonizing energies, I snagged the Rosebud Tarot off my shelf. This is the indie edition, but this deck is available mass market now. I think this deck is really beautiful. Here's the backs. I do not know what the changes are between the indie and the mass market edition, so you'll have to forgive me for that. But I think this deck is gorgeous. And there was something about those keywords of beauty and balance and harmonizing that just made me think of this particular deck. I feel like this deck does a really good job of balancing different elements on the card itself within the artwork. It is, I believe, digital collage, so collage done digitally, at least that's what it looks like to me. And it's beautiful, but you can see there's a lot of different elements that go into each of the cards. It's definitely a more minimalist collage style deck as well, but I do really enjoy its sort of romantic nature. It's very soft, it's very nurturing. It would feel like Venus energy to me. I do like that the backgrounds or the skyscapes that we often get in this deck are primarily black, which is something that I tend to gravitate toward in September and October. So during that seasonal energy, I tend to like the black backgrounds. And this particular deck has quite a few cards that are on black backgrounds or feature like sort of nightscape skies. And I think it's really wonderful to pull in that sort of October energy as well. But going back to our Libra, right? Decks that feel like Libra. This deck not only feels balanced in the way that it was created, it reads very balanced for me. But again, when it came to decks that feel like Libra, this was the deck that like first came to mind when looking at sort of that Venus energy, that beautiful, artistic, of course the whole deck is, it's an artistic expression as most tarot is. And I just think it's done really, really beautifully, really artistically. There's a lot of attention to detail and a lot of, I feel like harmonizing of elements and energies within this particular deck. So the next deck that I chose kind of also sits in that same space, I guess, where we have the sort of beautiful vintage aesthetic in the cards. This is the Dreamkeeper's Tarot. This is the mass market edition, and it is a beautiful, again, vintage style collage. Apparently maybe vintage is something that I associate with Libra energy. I don't know if that's a thing or just a weird association I have made in my brain, but I do have quite a few vintage sort of inspired decks here in this little collection. This deck is really romantic and dreamy in a sense, but it also, again, similar to the Rosebud, it's very practical in the way that it reads. So even though we have this really romantic, dreamy, very artistic, very inspired sort of imagery, the way that this deck has the ability to read really practical as well is a really beautiful blend, I think, of those two energies. And so it's another one that I thought of when I was, thinking about decks that might fit into this. Also, again, there's a lot of darker color palettes in this. I guess I tend to see Libra, or I'm thinking of Libra being where I live, and the seasonal energy that we're currently in my neck of the woods. Like dark and gloomy is something that I associate with this time of year. So that's kind of not necessarily gloomy, but that's kind of an energy that I guess I'm pulling into this Libra decks in terms of like just being like the darker side of romance. In Taurus, I had a couple of decks that I felt like were, very pretty and romantic, but they were a little bit more on the lighter side of things. Things like the Pavlov, things like the Tarot Muha. And then this feels like the other side of that. And I don't know if that's just me and something that's, coming about through the time that I'm actually doing this video and looking at these decks. It is, currently dark and gloomy and rainy here because I live in the Pacific Northwest and it's October. But I just feel like this deck does a really good job of sort of balancing that mystical and the mundane, and I guess that balancing, that harmonizing with that really beautiful, aesthetically pleasing overlayer is something that I guess I associate with Libra season. So again, I seem to have a theme because here we are with another collage tech, the Uncommon Tarot. This one is a beautiful mass market collage deck. I don't see this one talked about very often, but it's a stunning, affordable, very affordable collage deck. Again, there's something just really beautiful, soft, romantic, but it feels very balanced. It feels like, in a sense, almost like neutral collage, which is a really hard thing to achieve. It really walks that line between being like collaged, but not overly collaged, right? It gets like really, really close. But it's not minimalistic collage. It's not maximalistic collage. It does a really good job of sitting in between. Also, it's just beautiful. Like, again, we're in that same space of darker, moodier, but very sensual, very romantic. Like, the images themselves are just gorgeous and beautiful and full and rich. I love this Emperor. But again, we're sitting into that darker tone, darker energy. And I think that's pretty much where I ended up for most of these decks, with the exception of maybe one or two, is really just in this sort of beautiful, like, to me, this Devil is kind of like that shadow side of that beautiful romantic sort of energy, right? The shadow side of sensual, which is not a bad thing, right? We tend to get into that language of shadow equals bad, equals dark, equals, unsavory, and like as we know, shadow can mean a variety of things. So I'm not looking at it in the sense of like a negative sense. I'm looking at it in terms of the shadow being the unseen or the unrealized potential of something, which I think these decks do a really good job of showcasing. And maybe that's where that balance energy is coming in. Like, the messages are on the forefront with all of these decks that I'm showing you, at least for me personally. They do a really good job of speaking to the practical and working in a very practical sense. But there is something beneath the surface of all of these that I feel like balances out that kind of surface level experience. So it kind of like it sits in that space of it could go either way. And depending on which way you tip the scales, you could pull it one way or the other. You could pull this deck, these readings, more into the shadow, or you could pull them more into the everyday sort of light energy. And I guess, again, a broken record, that just seems seems to be where I ended up sitting with these Libra decks. So the next deck that I chose, again, still sitting in that same space of the masculine, romantic Venus energy. We have the Bianco Nero. And this deck, to me, feels like it sits in that Libra energy. Here's the beautiful backs. That black and white really, for me, speaks to the idea of harmonizing and balance, because it is the two ends of the spectrum, right? And we're finding that space in between. And I love this deck for that, but I also thought this would be a really great one for that Libra energy, because it also feels very much in the masculine Venus energy. It's very romantic, it's very sensual, it's beautifully illustrated. Like this page of Pentacles is a really good example, I think, of that energy. Like, he feels like masculine Venus. And I think that that's just like, it's beautiful. And I don't know that I would have ever made that association or had those terms come to mind for me with this particular deck had I not done this exercise. And then thinking about, why did I choose these decks, right? Because a lot of times when I'm coming to my collection and I'm picking decks for, you know, collection videos or assortment videos like these, I'm kind of doing so intuitively. It's more of a feeling thing. What deck feels like Libra in my very limited understanding of what Libra energy is? And I sort of intuitively pick my decks. And so it's really interesting as I talk my way through them here on camera with you to figure out why that is and why I chose these particular decks and what is it about that deck that really leans into that energy for me. So moving on to the 4 indie decks that I've selected. It's so funny that I pulled this one because I just did a video showing the 2nd edition of the Inkwitch Tarot. The Inkwitch Tarot is a favorite deck in my collection, and I could have just as easily pulled out the 1st edition, but the second one was on hand here. Here's the beautiful backs. Again, this deck to me, same as we've talked about in the last decks that we've looked at, masculine in Venus. It is beautiful, it is artistic, but it's also very balanced. There is a huge assortment of energies and elements that are spanned across this entire deck, but it's done so in a way that's incredibly balanced and incredibly thoughtful. And to me, that feels like a Libra energy, right? It's super intentional, it's beautiful, it's very balanced. It reads really well, similarly as I've talked about with the other decks. Like, I can use this deck for, you know, practical readings as well as more maybe spiritual or like higher vibrational readings as well. And it does a really good job of sort of blending all of that together. And again, it feels very, very beautiful, very masculine, but masculine in that Venus energy, which is just absolutely gorgeous. And I'm really happy to see that I have so many decks that I feel like sit in that energy for me. So the next deck that I have for you for a deck that feels like Libra, I think, is the Mystic Palette Tarot. And to my knowledge, these decks haven't shown up in any other deck-in, but I don't guarantee that they haven't. Here's the backs of this one. I have edged my copy of this deck, and this is a favorite deck of mine. But again, like, broken record here, looking at that sort of masculine in Venus, this deck for me just really sits in that space. It's lush and gorgeous and beautiful and like deep and rich. The color palette of this particular version, there is another colored version of this as well, but this particular version sits so well with autumnal energy for me, and it feels like it is September, October in a deck. But again, we're also looking at that overall energy of, it's a very balanced reader. It does a really wonderful job, again, of trying to traversing the magical and the mundane, the ordinary and the extraordinary. It does such a beautiful job of traversing and maintaining the balance between those things. It's such a gorgeous deck. I love this. It's up there in one of my top decks. I've done like multiple videos on this deck talking about its personal significance to me. So it was fun to see it end up here in this Libra category with so many of my other favorite decks. So interesting to think of how I must have a draw for that sort of energy in my tarot, because I had quite a few decks that I felt like kind of sat in this space for me. So the next indie deck that I chose that feels like Libra to me is the Rainshadow Tarot. And again, this is another collage deck, and it is a stunning, stunning work of art. Clearly that is an energy that I associate with Libra. Beautiful backs. Again, same kind of energy that we've talked about in all the other decks so far. It's beautiful, but it's kind of dark and moody. If I had to say it had an energy, I could definitely see it leaning into the masculine Venus. I think that's a great place for it to sit. It does a really good job of kind of traversing, like balancing those scales. That's the kind of the symbol that comes to mind, right? When we talk about Libra, this deck has the ability to balance that point between the mundane and the magical, because the way that this deck reads is very mundane in the best possible way, where it's like, it's very practical. I get very grounded, very rooted advice from this deck. But it also has the ability to bring in a bit of that magical energy in as well. It kind of dips into the shadow a little bit too. Clearly, I have an aesthetic thing going on with those sort of darker color tones, lots of shadowy energy. And again, this one also very artistically driven. It's gorgeous. And so I think it's a really cool one to sit in this space for Libra because of the way it reads. But clearly, like we're into that whole like dark, gorgeous aesthetic thing, right? That I've said for every single deck we've looked at so far. Okay, and the last deck I have to show you is actually a mass market deck, so totally had my count wrong, but that's okay. This is Heaven and Earth Tarot. I have edged my copy. Again, beautiful, beautiful. This one has a very masculine energy for me, but it also is in that really sensual, beautiful kind of energy that I would associate with Venus. So again, masculine and Venus energy. This deck also does a really good job of kind of like, as the name suggests, like heaven and earth. It does a really good job of blending those two elements together. Again, kind of seeing that balance point, keeping those scales, you know, even where we're staying in the mundane, but also being able to touch the magical. And I think this deck does a really good job of that. Clearly still sitting in that same dark, moody kind of a color palette. I'm kind of like, again, like Libra is like the opposite of Taurus for me. I have no idea where it actually sits, like in the sky or on an astrological chart or anything like that, because my astrology knowledge is entirely limited. And this is just me trying to find my way with all of these energies to this extent. For the first time, I've never looked at my decks through an astrological lens like this. It's not really how I work with my decks, so it's been a really interesting experience to try and put things into categories like this. But I think this is such a beautiful deck, and I really do love the way that it reads. So yeah, this kind of, again, similar color palette. This one's much, much darker than the others, I think, so that we're slipping much more into that sort of maybe Libra. I haven't looked at Libra 3 yet, but maybe more into that Libra 3. Also, in thinking about the tarot cards that are associated with Libra, I feel like a lot of these decks also have like the 2, 3, and 4 energy of the swords, and I can definitely see all that represented through the decks that I chose as well. So there we go, another 8 decks that I chose that for me feel like maybe they sit in Libra season space. I would love to know what decks you associate with Libra season, what decks you would have chosen, so definitely feel free to share with me in the comments below. As always, you'll find links for everything I've shown here in the description box of this video. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, and I look forward to sharing with you again soon.